What happens when a carefully orchestrated television interview spirals completely out of control? When years of pent-up frustration explode in front of millions of viewers and two powerful women find themselves locked in a battle neither saw coming. Today, we're diving into the shocking confrontation that had everyone talking. The heated clash that ended with security being called and a guest being escorted off set. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because this story gets wilder with every minute. The studio lights were blazing hot that morning as Gayle King adjusted her earpiece and shuffled through her notes one final time. CBS Mornings was live in just 3 minutes, and today's guest was expected to be their biggest interview of the month. Meghan Markle had agreed to sit down for what was supposed to be a friendly conversation about her latest philanthropic ventures and upcoming projects. The network had been promoting this exclusive for weeks, promising viewers an intimate look at the Duchess of Sussex's life beyond the royal headlines. 30 seconds, called out the floor manager, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the morning show set. Camera operators made their final adjustments while makeup artists touched up both women's faces under the harsh studio lighting. Gayle took a deep breath, her professional smile sliding into place as she prepared to welcome her guest. Meghan sat across from her looking poised in an elegant cream-colored blazer. Her hair perfectly styled and her trademark warm smile ready for the cameras. But those who knew her well might have noticed something different in her eyes that morning. A certain tension that hadn't been there in previous interviews. She had been dealing with a particularly brutal week in the tabloids. And despite her publicist's assurances that this would be a soft, friendly chat, Meghan couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something more complicated. And we're live in 5:43. The floor manager's countdown faded to silent hand signals as the red recording light flicked on. Good morning and welcome back to CBS Mornings. I'm Gayle King. She began with her signature warmth, and I'm here with Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, who's joining us to talk about some exciting new projects. Meghan, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for having me, Gayle. It's always a pleasure, Meghan replied, her media-trained voice smooth and controlled, though her hands remained clasped tightly in her lap. Now, before we dive into your philanthropic work, I have to ask about something that's been making headlines this week, Gayle said, consulting her notes with practiced ease. There have been some pretty intense stories circulating about your relationship with certain members of the royal family. I know our viewers are curious about your perspective on these reports. The question hung in the air, like a loaded weapon. This wasn't supposed to be part of the agreed-upon interview topics. Meghan's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, but she recovered quickly, her media training kicking in automatically. Well, Gayle, as I've said before, I think it's important to focus on the positive work we're doing rather than dwelling on tabloid speculation, Meghan responded diplomatically, trying to steer the conversation away from dangerous territory. But Gayle wasn't backing down. She had done her homework and she knew exactly which buttons to push. I understand that. But when these stories involve allegations about how you were treated by the institution, don't you think the public deserves to hear your side? Especially when some of these reports suggest there might be more to the story than what we heard in your previous interviews. Meghan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She had specifically requested through her publicist that family matters be off-limits for this interview. The betrayal of that agreement was already setting her on edge, but she maintained her composure. I think I've been quite clear about my experiences in previous conversations, Meghan said, her voice still measured, but with a slight edge creeping in. I'm really here today to talk about the important work we're doing with our foundation and the causes that matter to us. Gayle leaned forward slightly, sensing the tension, but pressing forward anyway. But Meghan, when you have a platform like yours, don't you feel a responsibility to address these ongoing questions? Some critics are saying that your silence on certain issues is actually speaking volumes. My silence? Meghan's voice rose just slightly, enough that the sound engineers noticed and made quick adjustments. I hardly think I've been silent about anything, Gayle. I've been very open about my experiences, sometimes more open than was comfortable for me personally. The studio audience, small as it was, could feel the shift in energy. What had started as a typical morning show interview was beginning to feel more like a cross-examination. Production assistants in the control room exchanged worried glances as they watched the interview through their monitors. "I'm not trying to put you in an uncomfortable position," Gayle continued, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But when you make certain claims in high-profile interviews, particularly claims that affect other people's reputations, don't you think there's an obligation to provide some kind of evidence or context?" Meghan's hands unclenched and reclined in her lap. The diplomatic mask was starting to slip, and years of frustration with the media's treatment of her were beginning to bubble to the surface. "Evidence," she repeated, her voice carrying a dangerous undertone that made the cameraman zoom in slightly. "What kind of evidence would satisfy you, Gayle? What kind of proof would be enough for people to believe that a woman of color might have actually experienced racism and mistreatment?" "Now, I didn't say anything about race," Gayle replied quickly. But Meghan was already shifting forward in her chair, her entire demeanor changing as the gloves started to come off. "You didn't have to say it explicitly. But that's what this is really about, isn't it?" Meghan's voice was getting stronger, more forceful. "Every time I speak about my experiences, every time I try to set the record straight, I'm questioned. I'm doubted. I'm asked to provide receipts that other people would never be asked to provide." The control room was buzzing now with producers debating whether to cut to commercial or let the confrontation play out. This was exactly the kind of unscripted drama that could either make or break a morning show depending on how it was handled. Gayle could see she had struck a nerve, and instead of backing away, she decided to lean into it. "Meghan, I think you're mischaracterizing what I'm asking. I'm simply trying to get clarity on some inconsistencies that people have pointed out. For instance, there are palace insiders who have contradicted some of your previous statements." "Palace insiders?" Meghan's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You mean the same anonymous sources who have been feeding negative stories about me for years? The same people who never seem to have names or faces, but always seem to have something damaging to say." The tension in the studio was now palpable. Crew members were frozen at their posts, unsure whether to intervene or let this train wreck continue. Gayle's co-hosts, who had been sitting quietly, were exchanging nervous glances off camera. "These aren't just random tabloid sources." Gayle pushed back, consulting her notes again. "These are credible journalists with established relationships within the royal household. When they report that your version of events doesn't match what actually happened, don't you think that raises legitimate questions?" Meghan's eyes flashed dangerously. "Credible journalists? Are we talking about the same media that hounded me for years, that published lie after lie about me, that drove me to the point where I had to leave an entire country because of the harassment? Those credible journalists? That's a very serious accusation to make about the press," Gayle responded, her journalistic instincts kicking in even as the interview spiraled out of control. "Are you saying that the entire British media establishment conspired against you personally?" "I'm saying that when you're dealing with an institution as powerful as the monarchy, and when that institution has relationships with the media that go back centuries, yes, it's entirely possible for narratives to be shaped in ways that serve certain interests." Meghan shot back, her voice rising with each word. The floor manager was now frantically signaling to the control room, but the producers were torn. This was explosive television, the kind of unguarded moment that could generate headlines for weeks. But it was also veering dangerously close to defamation territory, and lawyers were probably already being consulted. "So you're suggesting there was some kind of coordinated effort to destroy your reputation?" Gayle pressed, apparently oblivious to the fact that she was now conducting an interrogation rather than an interview. "I'm not suggesting anything, Gayle. I'm telling you what happened to me." Meghan's voice was now crystal clear and deadly serious. "I'm telling you that I was systematically undermined, that stories were planted, that my character was assassinated on a daily basis. And when I tried to defend myself, I was told to stay quiet and take it. But surely you understand that when you marry into the royal family, there are certain expectations, certain protocols that have to be followed," Gayle countered, apparently doubling down on her confrontational approach. "Protocols?" Meghan's voice cracked like a whip. "Is it protocol to leak private conversations to the press? Is it protocol to allow racist commentary about your unborn child to go unchallenged? Is it protocol to deny someone mental health support when they're contemplating suicide?" The studio fell dead silent. Even the camera operator stopped their subtle movements. This had gone from a heated exchange to something much more serious, much more personal. Gayle, perhaps realizing she had pushed too far, tried to regain control. "Meghan, I think we should take a step back here. These are very serious allegations, and I want to make sure we're being fair to everyone involved." "Fair?" Meghan stood up abruptly, her microphone pack nearly pulling loose. "You want to talk about being fair? Was it fair when your network, this very network, allowed commentators to question whether my children were actually royal because of their skin color? Was it fair when you yourselves participated in spreading rumors about my behavior without ever once asking for my side of the story?" Gayle was now visibly uncomfortable, glancing toward the control room for guidance. "Meghan, I think you're conflating different issues here. We've always tried to report on your story fairly and accurately." Fairly and accurately. Meghan's voice was now loud enough that people in the hallway outside the studio could hear her. "You want to know what's accurate? Let me tell you what's accurate. Your friend Oprah told me to trust you. Told me you were different from the other journalists who had been attacking me. She said, you would give me a fair platform to tell my story." The mention of Oprah Winfrey, Gayle's best friend and frequent collaborator, sent shockwaves through the studio. This was no longer just about Meghan versus Gayle. This was about broken trust and personal betrayal. "Oprah has nothing to do with how I conduct my interviews," Gayle said defensively. But her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Doesn't she?" Meghan shot back. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you used your friendship with her to get me here under false pretenses, just so you could ambush me with the same tired questions and accusations that I've been dealing with for years." The control room was in chaos now. Producers were shouting over each other, debating whether to cut the feed or let this continue. The legal team was on standby, and security had been quietly alerted to be ready if things escalated further. "Nobody ambushed you," Gayle protested, but she was clearly rattled. "These are legitimate journalistic questions about statements you've made publicly." Legitimate questions? Meghan was now pacing behind her chair, her composure completely abandoned. "Let me ask you some legitimate questions, Gayle. How much did you get paid by the palace for running interference for them? How many exclusive stories have you been promised in exchange for discrediting me? Because that's what this feels like, a hit job disguised as journalism." The accusation hung in the air like a bomb. Gayle's face flushed red, and for the first time in her decades-long career, she was genuinely speechless. "That is completely out of line," she finally managed to say, her voice shaking with anger. "I have never taken money or promises from anyone to influence my reporting. How dare you make that accusation on live television? How dare I?" Meghan whirled around to face her directly. "How dare I tell the truth about what I've experienced? How dare I call out the hypocrisy and the double standards that I've been subjected to? You want to know what's out of line, Gayle? What's out of line is inviting someone onto your show under the pretense of discussing their charitable work and then spending the entire time trying to discredit their lived experiences." The studio audience, what little there was of it, was completely silent, witnessing what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked about moments in morning television history. Camera operators continued filming, not sure if they should stop, while sound engineers tried to manage the increasingly volatile audio levels. "I think we need to take a commercial break," Gayle said, looking desperately toward the control room. "No," Meghan said firmly, moving back toward her chair, but remaining standing. "We're not taking a break. You wanted to have this conversation, so let's have it. Let's talk about journalistic integrity and fair reporting. Let's talk about how women, particularly women of color, are treated when they dare to speak truth to power." Gayle's professional facade was cracking under the pressure. 20 years of morning television experience had never prepared her for anything quite like this. "Meghan, you need to calm down and return to your seat. This is not how we conduct interviews on this show." "Don't you dare tell me to calm down," Meghan fired back, her voice echoing through the studio. "Don't you dare use that condescending tone with me like I'm some hysterical woman who can't handle a simple conversation. This is exactly the kind of dismissive attitude I've been talking about." The floor manager was now making frantic cutting motions across his throat, but the control room had made their decision. This was television gold, and They were going to let it play out until someone got hurt or said something that would land them in legal trouble. "I'm not being condescending," Gayle protested, though her voice betrayed her frustration. "I'm trying to maintain some semblance of professionalism while you're making wild accusations about my integrity and my relationship with Oprah." "Wild accusations?" Meghan laughed bitterly. "Everything I've said can be fact-checked, Gayle. Can you say the same about the stories you've been promoting? Can you honestly tell your viewers that you've verified every single piece of information you've used to question my credibility?" Gayle opened her mouth to respond. But Meghan wasn't finished. "Because I can tell you right now that at least 3 of the so-called palace sources you referenced earlier don't actually exist. I know because my legal team has been tracking these phantom sources for months. They're fabrications. Gayle lies created to make my story seem inconsistent when the real inconsistency is in the fictional narratives being peddled by people with ulterior motives." The bombshell hit the studio like a physical force. Gayle's notes suddenly felt heavy in her hands as she realized she might have been manipulated by the very sources she had trusted. "That's a very serious allegation," she said weakly, her journalistic training wearing with her growing panic. "Yes, it is," Meghan agreed, finally sitting back down, but keeping her eyes locked on Gayle. "And unlike the allegations that have been made against me, this one comes with documentation. Legal documentation that proves these sources either don't exist or have been paid to provide false information." The control room was in complete meltdown. Now, producers were screaming into their headsets, trying to figure out if they were about to be sued, while others were frantically researching the sources Gayle had cited in her preparation. "If what you're saying is true," Gayle began, her voice much quieter, then someone has deliberately fed false information to multiple news outlets." "Now you're getting it," Meghan said, leaning forward. "But here's the question, Gayle. Are you going to do something about it, or are you going to continue being part of the problem? Because right now you have a choice. You can acknowledge that you've been manipulated and help expose the truth, or you can double down on the lies and continue to be complicit in this character assassination." Gayle looked around the studio desperately, as if the answer might be written on the walls. Her co-hosts were frozen in their seats, afraid to say anything that might make the situation worse. The audience was completely captivated, witnessing what felt like a pivotal moment in media history. "I need to see this documentation," Gayle said finally, her journalist instincts overriding her panic. "No problem." Meghan reached into her purse and pulled out a thick manila folder. "I brought copies because I knew this conversation was going to go exactly where it went. I knew you were going to question my credibility, and I knew you were going to cite sources that don't exist." She slid the folder across the small table between them. Gayle opened it with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the legal documents inside. As she read, her face grew pale. "This says that 2 of the sources I mentioned are actually the same person using different names," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Keep reading," Meghan encouraged, her tone now more sad than angry. "And this one shows payments from a public relations firm with ties, too." Gayle stopped reading and looked up, her eyes wide with shock and betrayal. "To certain members of the royal household," Meghan finished. "People who have been systematically trying to destroy my reputation for years, and who have been using well-meaning journalists like you to do their dirty work." The studio was dead silent, except for the hum of the cameras and the distant sounds of chaos from the control room. Gayle closed the folder and sat back in her chair, looking like she had aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. "I had no idea," she said quietly. "I trusted my sources. I've worked with some of these people for years." "I know you didn't." Meghan's voice was gentler now, almost sympathetic. "That's what makes this so insidious. They've been using your reputation and your relationships to legitimize their lies. They knew that if Gayle King reported something, people would believe it because you're trusted and respected." Gayle looked down at her hands, then back at Meghan. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to tell the truth," Meghan said simply. "I want you to investigate this properly and report what you find, even if it's uncomfortable. Even if it means admitting that you and other journalists have been played. This could destroy careers," Gayle said, gesturing toward the folder. "Mine included." "Good journalism sometimes does," Meghan replied. But isn't that better than continuing to spread lies? Isn't that better than being a tool for people who are trying to silence someone for telling the truth about their experiences? Gayle was quiet for a long moment, processing everything that had just happened. The interview had gone completely off the rails, but in doing so, it had revealed something much more important than anyone had expected. "I need time to process this," she said finally. "I need to verify everything in here and figure out how deep this goes." "Take all the time you need," Meghan said, standing up and removing her microphone. "But while you're doing that, remember that every day you wait is another day that lies continue to spread, and another day that other people might be subjected to the same treatment I've received." She turned toward the camera, speaking directly to the viewers for the first time since the interview began. "To everyone watching, I want you to remember something. When someone tells you about their experiences, especially their experiences with discrimination or mistreatment, your first instinct shouldn't be to question their credibility. It should be to listen, to investigate, and to hold accountable the people and institutions that have power over others." With that, she walked off the set, leaving Gayle sitting alone with a folder of evidence and the weight of a journalistic reckoning that would reshape how the media covered not just Meghan, but anyone who dared to speak truth to power. The cameras kept rolling as Gayle sat in stunned silence. The folder opened in front of her, the evidence of her manipulation scattered across the desk like pieces of a broken trust that would never be fully repaired. Security never had to be called. The most explosive interview in morning television history had ended not with violence, but with the quiet devastation of truth finally being spoken in a place where lies had been allowed to flourish for far too long. So, what do you think? Was Meghan right to bring receipts, or should she have handled this differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories that dig deeper into the moments that change.